Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this École des Modernités lecture here at the Institute in Paris. I'd like to extend my welcome to Anneka Lenssen, who's sitting right to me. Thank you, Anneka, for joining us here in Paris for a lecture. You are Associate Professor of Global Modern Art in the Department of Art History at the University of California in Berkeley. And you hold the Tobin Family Faculty Fellowship. You were a co-editor in 2018 of the anthology I think most of you here know, called Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents, that was published by MoMA in New York. And you authored the monograph, Beautiful Agitation, Modern Painting and Politics in Syria, that was published in 2020. Today's lecture will deal with global path through Iraq mainly, but in discussions with other areas in the world. You entitled it Chronological Scope, but we're happy to focus on such very tight and precise contexts through artists that you, and they possibly won't be the only discussed tonight, that you named: Jamil Hamoudi, Jawad Selim, Jozef Czapski, and Joseph Boswell. And through those names, you understand that the lecture will focus on encounters between artists from various places in Iraq, with artists coming from Europe, mainly France and the UK. So thank you again very much, Anneka, for accepting this lecture. And well, I guess now the floor is yours. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Hugo. You're very generous. I had foreshadowed that I'm mostly going to talk about Baghdad and a little less on Damascus, so you kindly adjusted your remarks. And I want to thank everyone for joining in this very hot room, sandwiched between a wonderful workshop and May Day tomorrow. So it's especially meaningful that you've dedicated the time. And I can't imagine a more ideal audience, because the talk is engaging with lots of work that you're all actively producing. So I'm looking forward, I hope, to a great Q&A. So in this lecture, I'm actually going to begin by reminding all of us of some modernist developments in Paris in the years immediately following the Second World War. From there, I will attempt to work back to the conceptual force of this talk, which is indeed located earlier in the war years, 1941 to 1944, as well as elsewhere in Baghdad, along a militarized Middle East front of the war. But one reason to open with paintings and events from the period 45 to 50 is that they may be familiar to you, thanks to the brilliant recent efforts of a wide range of scholars, many of them here right now, to detail the conscious post-war re-internationalizing of the School of Paris and its marquee idiom, non-representational or abstract art. As we all know, and as we've been discussing in the past 2 days, by the 1940s, Paris had long held the distinction of a world capital of arts. It was a reputation that grew from the imperial 19th century onward, as many of the world's artists flocked to the capital, and the salon system broke open into new sites of training and access. But the actual conditions of inclusion and exclusion were complex, of course. So for those of us who participated in the Entangled Modernism's workshop these past 2 days, we were grappling with plural stories and political valences, including via the remarkable recent survey exhibitions that have helped to unbraid the assimilationist claims, often mobilized in celebration of political power or political consolidation. So that includes Paris Noir at the Pompidou, showing us freedom seekers of color, as well as brilliantly the Arab Presences exhibition of last year, curated by Morad Montazami. To these recent revisions, I propose to add an examination of artistic alliances that are often overlooked in scholarship on the transnational production of Paris effects and Paris hegemonies. Today I'm going to speak about artistic friendships and practices formed in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad during the war, and specifically those facilitated by Polish artists who were serving in the Polish army under British command and who were stationed in Iraq for more than a year, we think from the end of 1942 until perhaps early 1944. The Polish army harbored a handful of highly credentialed artists who had studied in Paris before the war. While in Baghdad, under the pressures of occupation and displacement, their group engaged in cultural outreach to both Iraqi artists and to international audiences. One plank of the message involved proclaiming a strong and intimate relationship to Paris in ways that resonated with Iraqi peers, with British propagandists, with Syrian onlookers, and with others, as I'm going to try to show here. So although I did not name Warsaw, the place, in my talk title, please know that many of the actors I'll be describing are Polish artists, and in this instance, Christian Polish artists, who were in Baghdad trying to recover their city for the freedom cause of the Allies. Open places and territory did matter to these artists. After all, incarceration and social concentration were tools of war, as they knew. And from Iraq, in newspaper articles and speeches, Polish intellectuals spoke about an ideal Paris, an open city that served as a capital of the arts, where anyone who prioritized art over other concerns could gather. And because their artists had already been transformed by this version of Paris when they were there in the 1920s, they claimed special authority on the topic of artistic freedom. Which is to say, as we know from other ways of telling this story, once Vichy reversed the universalized aspirations of the preceding period, once it set out to purge Jews and other non-French nationals from the city and send them to death, many artists outside Paris found common cause in the memory of this lost possibility. This becomes the ideological content of many photogenic moments of liberation. For instance, when American soldiers located Picasso in 1944 and discovered that he had kept on working in the service of a creative spirit, even after exhibition opportunities had been foreclosed. Less well known, and indeed far more complex, are the alliances formed in Baghdad around a spirit of keeping on working at precisely the years when artists in Paris had gone underground. My use of the term alliance is careful here, and I distinguish it from such rich concepts as entanglement that we were discussing yesterday. The latter, a term like entanglement, suggesting a degree of natural or even physical reciprocity and resonance, in addition to conscious co-articulations. When I speak of alliances, I am mobilizing the vocabulary of the war itself, which both expanded and arguably maintained boundaries based upon military associations formed for mutual benefit. Prior to the creation of the United Nations parliamentary body in 1945, the name United Nations referred to the Allies as a fighting force, a set of states with armies who entered into formal security agreements specifying mutual obligations. As a transactional articulation of recognized dependency, alliance refers to countries who agree to operate in interdependent but not equal ways. The wartime idea served to, one, justify the reoccupation of the Middle East and denial of its people's aspirations to freedom, and two, to align artists in Iraq, in Syria, in France, in Egypt, and beyond in surprising ways. And just to say quickly, I'm showing you the cover of an exhibition that was called United Nations Art Exhibition that featured Egyptian artists. It also featured Kenneth Wood, a British artist who was based in Iraq, and other active service artists. Ultimately, I contend that the lessons in modernism and alliance that we find outside Paris help us remake or rebut many of the cliches of renewal associated with the year 1945 and the resurrection of Paris's salon systems. First, consider this painting from post-war Paris. A composition in oil on board, dated 1947, and signed in both Arabic and Latin scripts, perhaps as an index of its artist's sense of traversing cultural domains. It is relatively small, only about 15 inches wide. The artist, Jamil Hamoudi, would have only just arrived in France from Iraq at a time of searching for renewed trajectories of painting. He held a fellowship from the Iraqi government that charged him with the task of soaking up trends and reporting on them back to Iraq. And in Paris, he witnessed a period of years when, as Natalie Adamson has analyzed, state-sponsored national salvage projects unfolded that presumed the continued global dominance of Europe and France's special role within it as a cultural arbiter-in-chief. Perhaps we can think of Hamoudi as registering the tensions, the impossibility even, of this moment. It's a painting that appears to combine at least two possible genealogies of abstract composition that were in place before the war. One, a possibly constructivist or cubist version of hard edges and ruled planes, in this case realized out of textured fields of color in red, orange, green, brown, and tan, presented in a seemingly arbitrary combination of color variety. The other genealogy more aligned to the biomorphism of certain kinds of surrealist painting, an outline of organic forms with nested protuberances resembling a germinating seed or a zoological egg of some kind. And here notice a couple of circles carefully traced serve as visual punctuation that perhaps link to the stylistic referent of Kandinsky or Arp. It would seem that Hamoudi has emphasized the capacity of line to be both positive and negative as a presence on a page, an agent of creation or destruction. Witness the way that he overpaints red with white pigment at certain points, breaking the visual continuity in the twisting arabesque whenever it intersects with an underlying straight line. So here he traces over the red when it's been bisected by the straight line underneath. There's an eagerness here to perform abstractly that we see registered in the surface texture of the paintwork. And it might be worth mentioning that Hamoudi is only 23 years old at this time. It's 1947. There's also a clear awareness, it would seem, of precisely the not yet settled questions of trajectory and participation that are typically attributed to this moment in France. Hamoudi had arrived in Paris already very actively engaged in the study of modern movements, primarily accessed via magazines with art reproductions that made their way to Baghdad in the war years. Some of the references in his writing over the period 41 to 44 suggest that he was sourcing material from mainstream French publications which favored realism and a staid post-impressionism. But his own artistic production and cultural commentary make clear that he had a core interest in otherwise degenerate trends such as surrealism and abstraction. Consider, for instance, the wooden sculpture he created around 1944. Titled Head of a Girl, it is constructed perhaps as a kind of frieze, two planes of wood laminated together. The edge of the bottom form is cut in ways that evoke Arp's constellation compositions. The touch of a jigsaw remains present. The curves do not have any bevels, one result being that natural forms come to look strange and awkward. Atop the bottom layer, the artist places a second one, a plane he more carefully formed with grooves, two drilled out holes as eyes, and concave shapes that link ideas of doors to ideas of facial orifices. The interest in tracing a split in the face to suggest perhaps a fusing of front and profile views owes much to Picasso. And we know that circa 1944, Hamoudi was scouring magazines for updates on Picasso and the Surrealists. In turn, if asked, Hamoudi would have almost certainly also cited ancient Mesopotamian sculpture as a reference for its remarkable achievement in simple plastic dynamism. Yet the overall, and he was working in the museum at this time in 1944. Yet the overall interest here seems to start from line more than from a recognizable thing or person or even work of antiquity. We are able to perceive the presence of the girl named in the title primarily through a single rippling line that serves to designate an idea of long hair. I've written elsewhere about how intellectuals in Baghdad in the 1940s debated the importance of invisible forces and internal sensation as elements of worldly knowledge. Many, including Hamoudi, drew sustenance from symbolist literary production that engaged, in the name of anti-classical modernism, with rapidly shifting emotions and state changes. There are elements of critiques of Cartesianism appearing in references to Sigmund Freud, Henri Bergson, and rejection of empirical study. This meant that the actual terms of entry into a recognized field of modernist visual practice, whether from Baghdad or from Paris, was often synesthetic and shifting, found in attitudes rather than bureaucratized competence in composition. Perhaps tellingly, one of the first dispatches that Hamoudi sent home for publication once he got to Paris was comprised of a drawing and a poem that he titled Alone Here. Narrating an entirely procreative experience of self as a solitary psyche in a forest, the poem employs an Orpheus-like frame. It talks about producing music whenever the silence terrifies him, about sighing notes that assemble themselves as chords, about acting with the kind of creative, self-making needs of a primitive man. He actually designates a kind of primitiveness in this poem. The accompanying drawing inscribed the location Paris, but showing nothing like an urban setting, renders body and instrument in equally swooping lines. Wings, dislocated from a mortal body, float in the air. Put another way, circa 1947, at the threshold to a Cold War landscape of ossified ideological styles divided between, let's say, the US and the Soviet Union, what becomes an equation between the liberal dictum of art for art's sake and descriptive keywords of flatness and self-referentiality was not yet in place. And I think we find that it wasn't yet in place for anyone. And this is, again, gratefully drawing on others in this room. Notably, some of the defining Paris initiatives of the mid and later 1940s and even early 1950s, such as the Salon of New Realities, took organizational form as a vast hybrid of models for organizing the world's art, including, and again, this is citing recent work, membership fees, general assemblies, a committee of honor, and sometimes, but not always, a system of national booths or areas that kept pace with inspiration from the United Nations, and sometimes did not. What was required was that the art be freed from direct vision, from origin in observed things. Hamoudi's activity during these post-war years not only reflects the multiple possibilities, scenes of negotiation between artistic and natural forms, between vitally organic and perfectly concrete art, but also offered possibilities to others. Because he cultivated friendships in Paris as a way to generate exhibition opportunities, we find him in a supporting role to the careers of an array of international figures. One is Brazilian artist Ligia Clark, who during her first stint in Paris, 1950 to 1952, practiced a kind of dream constructivism involving clouds of pigment across masked edges and planes. In June 1952, it was Hamoudi who gave Clark her first exhibit in Paris, at an Institut Endoplastique, a beauty salon that doubled as an art gallery, where she showed 16 paintings. Clark returned to Brazil soon after this, but the exhibition enjoyed interest from the larger New Realities crowd, with whom Hamoudi was already collaborating. Much of what I just recounted is already known and excitingly chronicled in my work and others' work. For instance, the dedicated announcement of revived internationalism in various salons that proliferated from 1945 onward. Or as Michel Cohn has argued, one could even look to the year 1943 in occupied Paris itself, before the actual liberation or end of the war, when certain galleries and promoters developed a discourse around the need for styles to continue evolving. This, in some forums, became a sign of a kind of exclusionary Frenchness, but elsewhere it promoted styles previously associated with an international standard. But the mechanism of transmission for claiming and keeping Paris as an open city and as an arbiter-in-chief deserves a much closer look, particularly in wartime conditions where formal exhibitions could not be mounted, where public commentary was not necessarily the chief mechanism of influence. Here, the example of Baghdad and its scenes of alliance becomes especially powerful as a lesson, for we can follow in the ephemera of the moment how transfers of influence took place at the level of drawing and composition, as well as in showcases with government patronage. As I foreshadowed, at the very same time in Paris, the famed capital of modernity and freedom, the Nazi occupation was foreclosing the ability for artists to leave or even to enter. At that same time, Baghdad offered certain displaced artists a place of refuge. A set of Polish artists, volunteer soldiers who'd been captured and imprisoned in 1939, came to Baghdad to train as part of a Polish army in exile. Paradoxically, the Polish soldier artists' freedom to leave Soviet prisons where they had been held and to travel overland through Iran came at the expense of the unfreedom of Iraqis. In the summer of 1941, Britain decided to reoccupy Iraq and to forcibly align its peoples with the strategic interests of the Allies. Nearly the whole of the subsequent military front, dubbed the Middle East, a tactical corridor connecting Cairo to Baghdad and onward to the Gulf and to Russia, experienced reoccupation by British militaries, or Free French ones at this time, in ways that shored up oil, airfields, and provisions for ships against the Germans. So Syria also undergoes reoccupation in 1941 by the Free French, and the Free French are in alliance with the British. And in November 1942, an Allied operation undertaken in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, also takes back territory from the Axis. Memoirs by Iraqi and Syrian artists make frequent reference to the difficult, grinding years of the war due to import controls, food and supply shortages. Baghdad was neither officially a war zone nor a home front, but nevertheless, to the British commanders in Iraq, self-determination was not even active as a possibility. Certain images from this period engage in highly tactical processes of externalization. Such is the case for the British artists pressed into service for the war. Numerous art historians have pointed to how certain military objectives took lessons from modernism, with the result being a surprising popularization of certain visual innovations. So for instance, Bill Hayter, the founder of Atelier 17, who we talked about yesterday, worked from 1940 to 41 on developing camouflage patterns. He and Roland Penrose and other artists created a whole manual published in 1942 of techniques for concealment, for which they derived lessons from Cubism and Pointillism. And Roland Penrose goes to Egypt in 1942 as well. So the tale I'm telling is actually one that's very densely about these alliances across the Mediterranean. Even British propaganda films, such as this one encouraging civilians to recycle paper scraps and rubber and other materials, employed modern visual tricks to convey ideas of inverted norms and historical transformation. In Iraq and the wider Middle East, however, the official British war artists who were dispatched to the region tended to maintain a dispassionate, technically competent style that was in keeping with their reporting mission to document the war and its logistics. Edward Bowden, a talented illustrator whose work runs toward the cute and the twee, he's kind of fascinating and a brilliant draftsman, came through Iraq in uniform in both 1942 and 1944 with an assignment to capture life and types and to make them familiar to a British public. And as a sidebar, of course, the reason he needed to make them familiar to a British public was the expectation that the region would remain a part of the British Empire for a long time to come. The subject to be depicted in Baghdad would have seemed relatively diffuse to a war artist. As Alan Ross puts it, major battles were not being fought in these places, but armies were training there and were passing through. So rather than depict wreckage, Bowden's images on the war front capture concepts of logistical headway. The British presence had been devoted to building a road route through Iran to be used for getting American supplies to Russia, and this vista is Edward Bowden's portrait of that logistical innovation. By contrast with the British war artists who simply passed through Iraq as outsiders, when large numbers of Polish soldiers were brought to Iraq in 1942 and 1943 to use Baghdad as a base to train under a reorganization of the Polish army in the east, the artists among them purposely cultivated close and generative interpersonal relations. A 1941 détente between the Soviet Union and Allied forces, compelled by Stalin's need to grow military power, had facilitated their passage. Russia released its Polish prisoners of war and allowed for them to rejoin the fight. British military interests saw the liberation of Poland as a strategic concept, if not actually a military objective. So they didn't commit themselves to Polish independence, but they spoke often about it as a war cause. And they provided the Polish troops with what now seems like a staggering amount of material help. The more accomplished Polish artists and writers in Baghdad formed a PR unit and started publishing a daily newspaper and other broadsheets in the Polish language. The same men were charged with the responsibility of outreach to Iraqi counterparts and to determine and demonstrate alliance at this interpersonal level. Conversely, Iraqi artists were called by their government to receive these artists as guests and to even share studios with them. The point of commonality for these artists in their alliance and their meetings was a mutual respect for Paris-based traditions, exhibitions, and training as an international standard. And the language spoken in these encounters seems to have actually been French. There were enough Iraqi artists who had gone to Paris briefly before the war, before they were expelled in 39 and 40, to start learning in the academies, and they had the kind of French artistic vocabulary that the Polish artists were also speaking. Most importantly for the PR narrative, several Polish artists belonged to the prominent group of modernist artists known as the Capists, the Polish acronym for the group of Polish art students who in 1923 organized a Paris committee to fundraise for their studies abroad in France. Among the Poles, there was a painter, Jozef Czapski, painter and writer, we should say, who had been released from detention in camps in the USSR. Czapski was a learned interpreter of French arts and letters, and as Eric Karpelis has recently detailed, he had attempted to sustain his human spirit while detained in prison by lecturing to fellow Polish prisoners on Proust and French arts from memory. There was also Joseph Jarema, who belonged to a Polish rifle brigade formed in exile following the invasion of Poland in 1939. That brigade in 1940 spent time in Palestine under the British Mandate, and then Cairo, also under the British Mandate. Over nearly a year in Egypt, this artist befriended leading cultural figures and mounted at least 2 exhibitions of his work, still lives and portraits made from flickering chromatic brushwork that he presented as a physical encoding of values of resistance. His words in Cairo in 1941 to the press said, "To exhibit paintings of this kind is to signal resistance against the new barbarism of the day." Another Capist was Edward Mutachak, who practiced both sculpture and painting. Just as a quick side note, this painting is often discussed as the most maybe exaggerated example of Baghdadi content meeting a kind of French-Polish post-impressionism in a way that seems to suppress the Baghdad aspect of the scene. So it's a scene in Baghdad painted with the atmospheric color of France of the maybe 19th century. One more side note, I still need to get the curator in Alexandria to pull this, so I don't know if this is the right color scheme, as is always the case working in reproduction. So I content myself by noting that most of these artists were also working in reproduction, where they had access only to color images. So the Capist or Capist identification of these painters really meant a lot. They had trained initially in Warsaw with a Polish painter who had himself gone to Paris at the end of the 19th century and learned color techniques and games of perception. Therefore, even prior to traveling, they were produced as adherents to an idea of Paris, and particularly a post-impressionist Paris. Once they got to the French capital in the 20s, they sought out masters of light and color, such as Pierre Bonnard and other, by then, post-impressionists. Uninterested in anything but formal questions, they made use of still life genres and landscapes as excuses to carry out their experiments in color relations. In the case of Jarema in particular, we get almost a single-minded emphasis on fields of points and brush strokes. Even his fellow Polish artists perceived him as unyielding in his devotion to chromatic color theory. So when he exhibited in 1943 in Baghdad, another Polish friend in the newspaper, in the Polish language newspaper, described the paintings as inaccessible to the regular Iraqis. What is more, Jarema was so committed to the oil-on-canvas format as the measure of civilizational value, as if to ensure Polish participation in a French salon of the future, that whenever he managed to secure supplies, he funneled them to his Polish compatriots and exhorted them to paint in ways that would demonstrate continued contribution to the world's modern totality. And then one more sidebar, I cannot resist because I have an audience of experts here. It's very interesting to me that the Polish artists seem to perpetually get lots of supplies from the British military, whereas the Iraqi artists always reported that they had trouble getting any supplies. So they had to butter up the British officers to get paint and paper, and the Poles were given paint and paper as part of the propaganda efforts in Baghdad. To an extent, the Iraqi artists experienced the arrival of their Polish compatriots as affirmation of their own potential as vessels for world historical art. They had not enjoyed a sustained period of access to Paris, but some leading figures, such as Jawad Selim, had gone to Europe right at the end of the 1930s and spent a truncated period there before the outbreak of hostilities. For Selim, the sense of, and I couldn't, here are some letters reporting on the cinema in Paris, which seemed to have been his primary interest, far more than the exhibitions in the museums. For him, for Selim, the sense of unfinished business or a feeling of interruption was very strong. In sharing studios with the Polish visitors and in doing their best to create conditions for the displaced painters to continue advancing their work, they also maintained the preeminence of France as a training destination, so that they too were propping up work with light and color as a measure of a worthy civilization. As Hamoudi, here he is in his national dress, as Hamoudi later recalled for a French audience, although the Poles seemed to fall from the sky, they all faced little difficulty in establishing a relationship to Iraqi artists based upon a commitment to art for art's sake as a modern principle with universal stakes. The Polish artists extended an invitation to the Iraqis to participate in what Jarema called a Paris team. The repeating maxim became, Baghdad kept on working while Paris could not. As others have also described, on February 15, 1943, an exhibition of paintings by Polish soldiers' artists opened in Baghdad. Organized by the Information and Cultural Office of the Polish II Corps with British support, it traveled subsequently to Damascus, Cairo, Alexandria, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. It has become difficult to ascertain precisely what the artworks looked like in this exhibition. Maybe you've made more progress than me. But I have trouble finding color images of the paintings. Some seem to have not survived. There aren't very many details about Jarema's paintings in particular. And although we know from a 1943 guide to the newly created Iraqi National Collection that the museum held a dozen works by Polish and other European artists, these seem to have been lost since, either to neglect or in the aftermath of the catastrophic American invasion of Iraq in 2003 from active looting. Also unknown are the whereabouts of most Iraqi paintings from the period. The same guide lists nearly 50 oil paintings, watercolors, caricatures, and drawings in pencil and charcoal. I'm not certain where those are. I can't exactly confirm them. I know from newspaper coverage that Czapski showed one oil painting and many drawings in the exhibition. A grayscale reproduction of the painting survives as a clipping. A newspaper reported that his one oil-on-canvas contribution, Landscape from Baghdad, quote, astounds us with its curious light where the blue hue plays with a wide gradient of shades, end quote. Czapski's drawings, meanwhile, were small, quick sketches made by fountain pen on plain notebook pages and lightly enhanced by color pencil. Critics reported being charmed by their energy and directness of observation. We must note, of course, that these artworks avoid destructive subjects such as war. Instead, genre scenes and specific views of sites in the region make up the preponderance of the work. The modality for keeping art moving was understood to reside in the art itself, in how formal solutions to problems of composition might emerge through an otherwise mundane still life. And for the most part, orientalized types are fairly infrequent too. I'm showing you one here, but for the most part, Czapski seems to have sketched landscapes. As Jamil Hamoudi, then a student of Selim's at the Institute of Fine Arts in Baghdad, observed, his own new generation of artists in the country soon came to credit the Poles with modeling how to live for art alone. And as Selim suggested, writing as early as September 1943, the Polish artists, quote, revived our relationship to Paris, end quote, and sparked new appreciation for the meaning and use of color. As I mentioned earlier, exhibitions were hardly the venue where influence was most intensely negotiated in an active sense. This is important to my argument. We know that Polish artists actually shared studio space, as I've been saying, which means not only were finished paintings proximate, but process was actually opened to vision, to discussion, and so forth. I'm not trying to suggest that full and equal collaborations or even robust pedagogies take place. I haven't found any evidence of that. But I have gathered some evidence of experiments and cataloged precedents that give visual specificity to desires for alliance. These, to my mind, offer a way to contemplate the element of subjection that is necessarily found in Baghdad under the Allied cause of freedom. That is, the lack of power inherent in the Iraqi artist condition of not being allowed to define their own social positions as artists in the war years. To practice a French style was to demonstrate alliance to a liberty cause, but it was also a state of subjection, a yoking to someone else's cause. First, for Iraqi artists, the lessons about working derived from the visiting artist put emphasis on preparatory techniques. For instance, the sketchbooks of Jawad Selim in the 1940s, which are lost now, unfortunately, but which were published in partial reproduction by Jabra Ibrahim Jabra in the 1970s, if I am remembering. Do I have it here? When? Arba Savayin, so in 74. As this page is from, they show Selim puzzling through the how of Bonnard's method. One imagines that Selim's intense engagement with Pierre Bonnard on the pages of his sketchbook must have been sparked by interaction with the Poles and their proclaimed allegiance to this master. Yet Selim's focus, at least in terms of the available material, is not paintings. It's a set of drawings in a 1934 folio of Bonnard drawings that had somehow come to Baghdad. Bonnard famously used sketches, a full repertoire of kinds of marks, to translate what he saw into plans for painting, including using hatches and dots to try to hold space for translation back into reverberating colors. To replicate the drawings he sees in the 1934 publication, Selim takes the repertoire of short hatches into his muscle memory, tries to learn to wield the pen. So he's drawing, looking at the Bonnard drawing, trying to replicate or to revive or to genuinely inhabit the moves of that artist. Yet there are obvious restraints as well. Here you can see that he has carefully inscribed the name Pierre Bonnard. Elsewhere, he inscribes the designation sketch. The artist labors to stay within the bounds of a drawing already given. Or we can return to Hamoudi, an artist who was just 18 years old in 1942, studying art and working at the Iraq Museum. Where has he been in this constellation, receiving Polish artists and aspiring to contribute to a world history of surviving modernism? He was already working as an animator of discursive communities for visual arts. Hamoudi published some commentary in local journals And he also launched his own handwritten magazine, Ashtarut, which was designed to circulate to students of the arts in particular. And I think it's handwritten not because it's secret in terms of challenging power. I think he genuinely was not granted access to a printing press. Surviving copies reveal that its digest-style content includes encyclopedia-like entries on European arts, reviews of exhibitions in Baghdad, assessments of Islamic art, and more. As such, Hamoudi and his cohort of very young artists were perfectly positioned, institutionalized even, to receive and propagate messages from their visiting interlocutors on topics like French art, as an entry in a contemporary curriculum. But in this case, too, demonstrating the existence of a tactical alliance would prompt exploration of certain kinds of artistic subjection, experiments in emulation and style. I show you here some pages from the gallery section of Ashtarut, which Hamoudi populated with sketches drawn by hand, as well as pasted in, and reproductions whenever he could access them. These show a range of kinds of work, some clipped, as I was saying, others hand-drawn. I'm actually most interested in the sketches that Hamoudi includes here. Sometimes they're pedagogical, so he has to draw examples as illustrations, but other times they're simply artistic sketches, responses to his experience of settings in Baghdad, such as Oriental Cafe, or as here on the right, the cinema. In the latter case, this tender portrait of a young man in a uniform that is likely to be the national Iraqi one, but maybe that of a British soldier, we see in the drawing not just a person with recognizable features, but also a catalog of how to work in ink in order to capture light effects in a darkened room. Once again, an idea of how an artist such as Bonnard might approach the task seems operative. All different marks and shapes, licking marks, short pock marks, etc., appear here. The effect seems to be staged as a virtuoso product, a work by an artist with many tools. The idea of creating a digest of forms, a kind of gallery of clip art, is very operative in the 1940s, as we all know from figures such as André Malraux, who published his discussion of the Imaginary Museum in 1947, but worked through it much earlier. Photography had enabled a processing logic of comparison, of an imaginary museum of always available images from all civilizations and times. And before him, of course, Aby Warburg. It's a long tradition. But equally, the presence of Jozef Czapski, who was a brilliant cultural theorist and intellectual historian, also encouraged Iraqis to observe and assess a catalog of precedents that were available to them. Czapski, rather than Yarema, is the person that Iraqis remember as being very inspiring in his message. He seems to have engaged in the study of historical arts and local forms in the Middle East. Even during his convalescence in Iran prior to arriving in Baghdad, he managed to go out and visit Timurid sites and photograph the ornamental schemes, the very scenes that he'd previously read about in Paris at a time when post-impressionists were drawing gratefully on Islamic arts, but had never seen in person. So we get his photographs and his little notes about the forms. From Baghdad, he wrote articles praising the Sumerian art in the Iraq Museum for its formal achievement. Diary entries reveal that he sketched in museums and sites in Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, and elsewhere. As Jawad Selim has very famously gone on to discuss in a diary entry, Czapski once joined them all in a cafe and advised the assembled Iraqi art students to attend to the uses of color available to them in Eastern pictorial traditions. Apparently, Czapski had detected a sense of nihilism among young Iraqis in terms of their relationship to local conditions, and he told them to change their attitude, to hold on to love for their country and keep themselves open to its distinctive inspirations that had not yet been tapped by world artists. This made a huge impression. So even though Hamoudi lacked a printing permit or reprographic devices, his version of an art digest retains this kind of ideal. So it's on a ground of comparison that occasional Orientalist readings of place creep into the art that's being made in this alliance. The February 1943 issue of Ashtarut carried a folio devoted to Islamic arts, which included translation of texts by scholars, French scholars, as well as a brief synthetic musing by Hamoudi. The image program included clipped photos of earlier ceramics and drawings of them as here, but it also included tracings of distinctive Abbasid carved ornament. These could have belonged in an artisan's manual or album. The imminence of each and all design pops off the stage, like you can just clip this and apply it to other surfaces. Further, within the rubric of alliance and emulation, I can't resist highlighting that a similar combinatorial logic makes its way into the portraits by Edward Bowden, our British soldier artist. The one area of stylish abstraction in this very sweet portrait is the passage of surface design behind the boy's head. Potentially concave or convex, wrought iron or carved out plaster, it resolves only as a pattern of its own. We imagine Bowden was influenced by his own necessary relation to the city as a museum, the need as a graphic designer to pull out the telling detail or the stand-in. Perhaps he saw museum displays in the Iraq Museum that Selim Hamoudi had worked on. I have one further node to highlight from alliances found in Baghdad. The Poles may have been preaching an art of total composition as the surrogate for their lost country. But the young Iraqis sustained an interest in surrealism throughout the war and thought of it as an opposing visual force driving toward a deformation or expression of dark modern energies. In this, they again had alliances to compatriots both near and far. In February 1944, Hamoudi published, meaning he translated and copied, an article from 1944 that had been originally published in the British journal Lilliput. The article detailed how all of France's surrealists had either fled, gone underground, or turned rightward as Vichy collaborators, leading to a loss of the scene. As a way to illustrate the very idea of surrealism for readers of his handwritten journal, in this case, Hamoudi chose to replicate in pen a 1933 sketch by Picasso, which he had likely accessed in reproduction in a British journal. It is a beach populated by the surrealist double imagery that had fascinated the artist during a summer in Cannes. Constructed bodies out of reticulated odds and ends, crumpled flags and twigs. The perverse quality of this drawing matches the others in this series, which is the only overt surrealist one of Picasso's career. An erotic charge of chance encounter mixes with a foreboding abject quality of subjects and objects, whether classical ruins or upright figures that are inverted into bones and fabrics and flags. Because Hamoudi copies the drawing, rendering one kind of ink wash into a different handling of ink. For instance, look at the clouds, from diluted fogs to hatches. His copy of Picasso doubles as an original drawing. Here again, the space of the late imperial front in Baghdad is a pedagogical one of inequality. Artists, teachers, and students try to inhabit one another's lines and habits of arrangement, in the process doubling and perhaps inverting those relations. We can compare to another surrealism encountered in this war in Baghdad, the drawings of James Boswell, a young soldier who worked as an unofficial war artist. He tried to be selected by the British government, but he was refused because he was very active in the labor movement. He was stationed in Iraq in the barracks for part of the war, and he subsequently donated his sketchbooks to the Tate. Boswell had no orders to make art, let alone make connections to Iraqi artists. His depictions of the ennui of the life of a soldier have to do with his desire to preserve his authentic thoughts and patterns from the field for future use when the war had ended. They are skeptical in outlook, attentive to class struggle and to humiliations and corruptions of all kinds. The dehumanizing effects of soldier training are a leitmotif, and the surrealist vocabularies of the 30s, those reticulated bodies made out of bones, it's almost like a camera inside dark cavernous spaces so as to frame a figure out of holes and gaps in the walls. In other words, such images let into the picture plane elements of things that had stopped working, collapsed buildings and abandoned social codes. Boswell's notebooks are filled with vignettes from unsavory soldier life, including the booming sex work trade in Baghdad. Iraqi artists, too, occasionally turn to the task of depicting social ills and losses. in contrast with the Polish artists, whose campaigns to recover sovereignty seem to offer no space to step back into disquiet or mourning. Here on the right, we have Jawad Selim painting sex workers. You can notice that he has adopted the post-impressionist techniques of modal color contrast and bravura outline that were active in the scene. I have just one final little node before concluding. Before shipping off for Italy in early 1944, the Polish artists made a big push to propagate their message widely in the region. Part of the Polish army strategy involved ever-expanding public relations. They did not want to let the Allies sell out their independence cause. Recall that the February 1943 exhibition in Baghdad traveled on from there to other cities in the constellation of British-held and Free French-held Arab regions, including to Damascus, Syria. And this became an occasion for Jarama to come to Syria and deliver a talk to the members of the Studio Veronese, a painting society with membership from young Syrians. Jarama is reported to have focused again on his color theories of chromatic divisionism in the context of European art movements and their trajectories toward form. I know I'm going on, but just imagine being in Damascus in 1944 and this person comes and talks to you about chromaticism and divisionism, and you're wearing your uniforms of a voluntary defense force in Damascus trying to get the French out. His appearance really made an impression. The Syrian artists were at that time working on establishing professional recognition for art. Here was someone declaring that art was important for its own sake. They stayed in touch with Jarama as skeptics. Later, they write about him as a caricature or an exaggeration. But once he packed out with his unit to fight on the Italian front, he opted to settle in Rome and to found an international art club, modeled loosely on the International Pen Association of Writers, that was devoted to promoting a shared artistic language of shapes and colors, divorced from ideology. The presence of Jarama is noted in several sources, but unlike in the case of Iraq, he is credited with almost no outright influence, more an oddity or a message. Nevertheless, the signifiers of a painterly project, oscillating color and dimensional paint application, immediately start to appear at this time in painting in Syria. Consider this painting an image of the aftermath of French aerial attacks on Damascus in 1945 in a late effort to prevent Syrian independence. Painted by Mahmoud Hamad, a young member of the Studio Veronese, it's an image of a burning parliament building in a shallow impasto set of marks. The Damascus skyline is studded by the vertical lines of minarets and civic buildings, but it also holds feathered strokes of cadmium pigment. Hamad mixes the red of the fire into white and black pigments on his palette, imbuing the facets of the buildings with a pink glow. Equally, touch has a role to play here in creating a sense of barrier between self and place. The shrubs in the foreground fill nearly half of the space with a dark painterly texture. It catches the light as pattern, but barely suggests an idea of vegetation. Although a depiction of war, Hamad's painting is not an evocation of catastrophe. It's highly composed and constructed in paint. It even at times seems to be about paint. Of course, not all Syrian painters became second-order impressionists. To the contrary, they soon moved on to other styles and approaches to composition. But lessons about color as a site of energy, and energy that could be used independently of subject, remained in play in important ways, including, as time went on, a growing belief that pure color and line could also be used to create natural, unmotivated, fully Arab Syrian art. One remarkable attempt comes in 1955 by Edhem Ismail, an oil painting titled Dubki. It associates looping linear traces with a polyphony of lines in other media, the idea of dance or music. As an evocation of the Arab folk dance, the Dubki, it features curls of anthropomorphic outline that appear to dance in the air above a forest landscape. In using contour lines in place of figures, Ismail attempts to transcend the material fact of having to use paint to create the picture. His is the other side of abstraction, starting not from light hitting perceptible objects and creating certain effects, but instead starting from internal rhythms, thinking of form as disclosure. So, back to Hamoudi and his touching experiment in new painting circa 1947. I have now traced alliances in a full circle fashion. Ismail's painting came after this one chronologically, so 1950 and Hamoudi 1947. But Ismail almost surely knew Hamoudi's dispatches from Paris. He read the journal El Adib, and the following year, in 1951, he responded to an announcement that Hamoudi placed in El Adib, soliciting materials for an edited volume about modern art. So how to see a painting like this, given all that I have shared of its backstory? In some ways, it is so very clearly composed with an outcome in mind, such as the Salon of New Realities. But in other ways, it is a vessel of all the aspirations to survival that were sustained in Baghdad, around an idea of Paris that had never existed, and which Iraqi and Polish painters alike knew would never exist in the future. What we find in Baghdad, 1941 to 1944, I've suggested, are conditions of forced alliance that saw artists contributing to sustaining a version of Paris as a standard of civilization that the Allied military cause embraced as a cause of recovery, freedom to move, assemble, and to pursue art for art's sake without restraint. In tracing the alliances forged within a fractured Allied cause at the late imperial moment of the 1940s, I've been following a model set forward by such colleagues as Irene Small, who notes that one of the imperatives of a global history of art is to excavate cartographies of exchange and the expansive, transgressive, and non-normative histories of modernism they imagined. But as she also counsels, in the effort to reestablish the global complexity of art history, we also need to seek methods for recovering and narrating links that are fragile and vulnerable, and that often entail, if not failure, certain opacities and intervals that pertain to institutionality, canonicity, and constraint. So on the one hand, the era of direct exchange between Iraqi and Polish impressionists via Paris ended relatively decisively once the Polish II Corps transferred out of Baghdad, went to Egypt, and then on to Italy to join up with the British Eighth Army and fight in Monte Cassino in May 1944. Czapski returned to Paris ultimately, and the cause of Polish independence was not realized under Allied supervision. Jarema settled in Rome, where he began to organize a new international association that I mentioned, the Art Club, meant to facilitate artist-to-artist relations and to cut out government mediation. The British artists returned to civilian life in the UK. Hamoudi got to go to Paris, and Selim went to London. So we have a great scattering of the alliance of Baghdad. But on the other hand, it persists in our present moment of relay and transmission, in the dream that form might offer us sites of inscription that differ from the political boundaries that we've been asked to inherit. It persists in the urgent need to forge mutual defense pacts and mutual aid, and the risks involved in setting friends against foes. And it persists in the hope that it might be possible to learn from others and claim other futures together in imagination. Thank you very much.